Welcome to Real Estate Resource. Thanks for stopping by. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you'll know when new videos are available. I really hope you enjoy this one. Okay, so last week we didn't quite get through all of the counters. I thought we would, but we're going to finish them today. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about like the nuts and bolts of the counteroffer, right? Which forms you're using, when to send them, the stuff you could do with it, just besides what you write in them. All right, so let me share my screen. All right. And you guys should be looking at the RPA and the counters. And I think we had just looked at, if I'm not mistaken, we just looked at the loan and the appraisal contingency. Is that correct? Do you guys remember from last week? I think that's where we left off, but I'm going to back up just a little bit to make sure I don't miss anything. Okay, so credits. Let's start with the credits because I think that we probably had done that. We gotten to that point, but let's just start with the credits. Remember, if the seller is not going to pay a credit, we're talking about paragraph 3G1 right here, which would be attached to this closing cost credit right here. If they've asked for a closing cost credit in their offer, and your seller is not going to pay it or is going to pay a different amount, then your credit is going to look like this, or your counter is going to look like this. Seller will not provide a credit for buyer's closing costs, or seller will provide buyer a closing cost credit in the amount of, right? So either I'm not doing it or I'm changing the amount. Again, quick, easy, straightforward. So it shouldn't be an issue, right? I think that's pretty straightforward. But just a recap of what we did last week is the counters that I'm going to show you that are on this PDF are going to match paragraph by paragraph. So it's just easy for you guys. When you look at something in your purchase agreement, you'll be able to look right over at this form. One other thing is I did make one change since last week because there was something and it was driving me nuts. I left it off, and we'll get to it today. But if you have last week's updated counters, send me an email again today, and that way I can get you the ones where I just made this change. Okay. All right. Additional financing terms. We talked about that last week. Should be nothing but if they're qualifying for some kind of special loan program, right? Down payment assistance, something like that. Or if you've written a cash offer and they want the option to be able to get a hard money loan, then you would write that in there. Okay. All right. We talked about this part already, the G3, which was the seller's obligation to pay buyer's commission. That goes along with the buyer representation agreement we talked about 2 weeks ago, where if the buyer is paying a commission to the agent, the buyer can ask the seller to be responsible to pay that commission. Not the commission that's being paid by the listing broker to the buyer's agent that's in the MLS, but the separate obligation. This is asking for the seller to incur more costs and pay that. Okay. So that's what that's about. That's 3G3. That would include a separate form that needs to be included in the offer, but that would be your counter offer here. Seller will not pay any obligation the buyer may have to compensate buyer's broker. That shall solely be the responsibility of the buyer. 3L 1 and 2. Right, we're going to go down here. These are the loan and appraisal contingencies. Again, we talked about that. If we're going to change those time periods, that's where we would do it. The only reason I would change the loan contingency period, and we talked about this last week, is if they were giving me a shorter escrow period and I wanted to reduce that period of time. That's it. Only reason. The appraisal contingency, we talked about that also. I want to counter the appraisal contingency. I'm going to probably ask for 12 days or sooner, or for a 12-day period instead of a 17-day period. So that way I know if there's any appraisal issues, they come through sooner. So that would be with one thing I would do would be shorten the appraisal. And I would do that even if it was a 30 or 45-day escrow. I would shorten the appraisal contingency. Just because if there's an appraisal issue, I want to know early. And 12 days is more than enough time for them to get the appraisal done. if you're asking, and I don't recommend this just because, and we talked about this, if you're asking them to remove their appraisal contingency with their offer, then that would be the counter there would be to remove this with acceptance. Buyer agrees the appraisal contingency is removed with the acceptance of this offer. You could go further and ask for the contingency removal, but it's not necessary if it's written there. If we're going to change the appraisal value, and this is the one that people get stumped on the most, is that let's, for example, say that I have listed my house for 600,000. You are making an offer at 650. I am now going to counter you back that you do have an appraisal contingency that's 12 days long, but it only if it appraises for less than 600,000, which was my list price, just to protect my list price. That's what I'm going to do. If this is FHA or VA, remember the FHA amendatory clause also has to be updated to match whatever price you are attaching to the appraisal contingency. So for example, if the offer's at 650, the FHA VA mandatory clause probably came in at 650. If I'm changing that appraised value to 600, I also need to send a new FHA mandatory clause with that $600,000 value, because with FHA and VA loans, because of that amendatory clause, if the property doesn't appraise for the amount that's on the amendatory clause, even if the buyer has no appraisal contingency or loan contingency, they will not lose their deposit if it doesn't appraise for that amount. Okay. All right. Investigation of property. We look at 3L3, which covers investigation and informational access. Again, I'm good with the 17 days on a 30-day escrow. I don't see the necessity to shorten it to 10 days. But that also becomes a business decision for you. I would shorten it though if they were sending me one of those offers that was a 21-day escrow, so I would shorten that to probably 10 days. The informational access has to match the longest amount of time that they need access. So if I'm giving them an appraisal contingency for 12 days, I have to give them informational access for 12 days. And what informational access says is just for that period of time, I have access to the property. So even if, let's say you get an offer from a buyer that has removed all of their contingencies, this informational access section right here is still in effect, which means that even if I don't have any contingencies, I still have access to the property. I can still go do inspections. I can still do anything. It just means that the property is not contingent on me approving those inspections. Okay. So if I'm going to change the investigation of property, buyer to have 10 days to do all of buyer's investigations, then I must also counter informational access to property is the same. Buyer to have 10 days or 10 days or 12 days, depending on my appraisal contingency, for informational access to property. Okay. The review of seller's documents should match the same as the investigation. I shouldn't have to make those longer. So I leave those longer. So again, if I shorten it to 10 or 12 days, then I have to shorten that for the review of seller's documents. And the same thing goes for all of these, right? The preliminary title, the common interest disclosures, review of leased or liened items, all of that stuff kind of falls into the same time period. So if I shorten investigation, all of those get shortened the same amount of time. Okay. You could make it simpler if you didn't want to line out each one and just say all buyers contingencies to be removed in this amount of time. You could do that, and that would be fine. Go ahead, Charlie. You raised your hand.
Hey, Kyle. So the informational access is just pretty much access to the property throughout that time period. The agent has access to that property pretty much. They can do inspections, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, the buyer has access, yes.
Okay.
All right. Let's move on here. Okay. The leased or liened items, I know where it says review of leased or liened items, that's the time period for that. But at this point, I'm also going to disclose what leased or liened items were there. I don't care if you put it in the MLS. That doesn't matter. The MLS is not binding. Only the commission offered from the buyer's agent or the listing agent to the buyer's agent is binding in the MLS. So I'm also going to disclose this, even if I put it in the MLS, even if it was public, the whole thing, I'm going to put the property includes leased or liened items, buyer to be aware the leased or liened item is leased, has a lien, is attached to the property, buyer to assume lease, accept the lien remaining with the property. That's what I'm going to disclose, and I'm going to ask them to accept it. I'm not going to make it a contingency, I'm basically saying you are going, as long as the company that has leased the item to the seller or placed the lien on the property, as long as they will allow you to accept that, then you're responsible. There's no question about it. You can't come back and say, no, I'm not going to be responsible. No, you are, as long as they'll allow it. Yes, Charlie, go ahead.
So Kyle, if they don't accept the lease or lien items, then the contract is canceled?
It's a contingency of the contract that they are able to either assume the lien or assume the lease. That's the contingency. What I'm saying is that they don't have an option to say no, as long as the company that carries that lease or lien says yes. But if you don't put that verbiage in, they have a contingency period that says, you know what, I don't want to accept it. And that 16 days, 17 days, 10 days, 5 days, whatever you give them, they have the right to cancel based on that contingency. Okay. All right. Let's try as much as we can to stick to the counter specific. We're going to go into the RPA in another video where we'll talk about what the contingencies mean and all those things. Let's try to stick as close as we can to just to the counter so that we can get through them today. Okay, contingent on sale of buyer's property. Okay, now there's a couple things. We're looking at paragraph 3L8 right here. If they've checked off this box that it's contingent, and for some reason they didn't include the COP, or if I don't agree with the way the COP was filled out, right? If I don't like the terms of the COP, then I'm going to be CAR form COP to be incorporated as agreement, form provided to be signed and returned with this signed counteroffer. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put my own COP attached to it. If either A, there isn't one, they didn't send it, they just checked off the box that it was contingent, or B, I don't like the terms of the COP. I'm going to change. I'm going to write up my own COP. And that's what you guys should do. Any addendum, amendment, any kind of ancillary form that comes with the purchase agreement, if I don't like the terms of that form, I need to redraw that form, redraft it, do it with the terms that my seller and I agree with, attach it to my counteroffer, send it with, and have verbiage in the counteroffer that says, the buyer will sign and return with the signed counteroffer. And that's what I'm going to do with the COP. So if it is contingent, they did include the COP, or they didn't include the COP. They didn't include the COP, or they did just with terms I don't agree with, I'm going to provide my own. Okay. And if I am contingent, this is going to be my spot to remind me to counter that the offer is contingent. Like I'm contingent on finding a replacement property, right? So the counter for that would be sale is contingent on seller purchasing a replacement property and escrow's closing concurrently. CAR form SPRP to be incorporated in this agreement. Form provided to be signed and returned with this counteroffer. Plain and simple. Now what happens is that SPRP becomes part of the counteroffer. There's even a check, and I'll show you when we get to look at the counteroffers today, that you check off to add the SPRP as part of that counter. Okay. Questions about that so far? Those items. Okay. All right. So now let's look at the occupancy and the time of possession and things like that. So we're looking at 3M1, 2, and 3 in the next two sections here. So occupancy for seller occupied properties, right? We're going to put occupancy to be delivered at 6 p.m. 3 days after close of escrow at zero cost to seller. Seller agrees to pay blank dollars per diem for any holdover beginning day 4 after close of escrow. CAR form SIP to be incorporated into this agreement. Form provided to be signed and returned with this counteroffer. Now that's a normal seller in possession counter. Not a contingent offer, just I have a seller in possession. And this is something that us as buyer's agents and listing agents have to understand and have to incorporate, and it should just be by default. Every time there is a seller in possession, there should always be a minimum of 3 days after close of escrow that seller remains in possession, okay? That's number one. Number two, I added in the seller agrees to pay a per diem, right? And that's for any holdover after day 3. So if I get 3 days for free for my seller, and then I know that sometimes things happen, people get sick, emergencies come up, for some reason we can't get out after that 3rd day. And remember, we don't know when the 3rd day is. right? We don't know at that time. At the time we're writing this, we don't know what the third day is. We're estimating because this is a 30-day escrow. So if I look at today and say, okay, we're going to get acceptance and it's going to be a 30-day escrow. And that 30-day escrow would mean that 30 days from now is what, the 22nd or so, 27th of February, and it's a Tuesday or a Wednesday, and now my sellers can't move out, we don't close until a Friday or a Monday, and they can't get out because they need the weekend to move out and do all those things. That stuff happens, but we don't account for it. As a listing agent, we have to see the future a little bit. We have to try to minimize, and that's what these counters are for, is to minimize the obstacles and the problems that we may run into. That's what they're there for. So that's why I always say we're going to ask for a minimum of 3 for my seller, and then we're going to agree to $100 a day, $75 a day, 150, whatever you feel is reasonable. And if we stay 4 or 5 days instead of 3, right, we have 2 additional days. Well, then we owe them a couple $100 or $300. But the reason I do that is because any kind of per diem that you have as far as staying in possession for the seller is a benefit to the seller, not to the buyer. I mean, it is to the buyer in a way, but more to the seller. So let me give you an example. My seller gets 3 days for free. We've agreed to that. Buyer agreed to that. Everybody's good with it. Day 3 comes and goes, and the seller has some emergency or some reason, a reasonable reason. It's not malicious. They're not just like, well, I'm not moving, so I don't care. They have a reasonable reason for not moving out. But because now they're in breach of contract, if the buyer incurs any damages and they can prove those damages, the seller could be liable for the total value of all those damages. So let's say that, they had to get a storage facility and rent a hotel because they didn't have a place to live. The storage place cost them money. They lost their deposit on the moving truck. They had to miss work, whatever it is. They proved that they ended up with $1,500 to $2,000 worth of damages for those couple of days extra. And then they go to small claims and they go after the seller, and the seller is now in default, right? They breached the contract. The judge could very well say, no, you owe them this $2,000 for the cost they incurred because you didn't move out when you said you would move out. That's if we don't have the per diem. Now we have a per diem in place where it says, I'm going to pay you $100 a day if I stay later. If there's an emergency, something comes up and I can't move out. So my seller stays those extra 2 days. Now their only cost, the only consequence of that is that they pay the buyer $200. And the buyer gets the $200 and they don't have to fight over it. There's no need for me to try to come up with any expenses or show why I was damaged in some way. You've already agreed to pay me. So the benefit to the buyer is you already agree to pay me if something comes up and you can't move out. The benefit to the seller is it limits any damages that I may have to pay to just this amount that we've agreed to. Okay? Questions about that and why I want to incorporate that in the counter? Yes, Charlie, go ahead.
Hey, Kyle, so the per diem protects your seller in a way?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, if it's a contingent sale, occupancy to be delivered at 6 p.m., 10 days after close of escrow. The reason I do 6 is because the contract now is at date of recording, right? Like as soon as you get acknowledgement of recording, that's when the occupancy starts. That's when the time of possession starts, right? Upon notice of recording, that's the default. So I'm changing it to 6 just to say, hey, at least on the date of close of escrow, we have some time before you're like, hey, this is my place, right? So occupancy to be delivered at 6 p.m., 10 days after close of escrow at 0 cost to seller. Seller agrees to pay, again, the per diem for any holdover beginning on day 11 after close of escrow. CAR form SIP to be incorporated into this agreement. Form provided to be signed and returned. Now, remember, the SIP is good for 29 or fewer days. If we go past that 29 days, it goes to 30 or more, then we have to use the RLAS, and that's what this next counter is. Occupancy to be delivered at 6 p.m., 45 days after close of escrow. Seller to pay blank amount for possession of property, a per diem or a monthly amount, whatever you guys come up with. CAR form RLAS to be incorporated in this agreement. Form provided to be signed and returned with this counter. Now, When it's not contingent and we're renting back, I generally don't ask because it's so much time. I generally don't ask for any free time for my seller. I just say, hey, we're going to pay rent. Okay. So the reason, if we go back to contingent sales, the reason I put that 10 days in there is because I know that if I'm contingent on purchasing, I'm going to close escrow. Then I've got to transfer all the money, all the funds have to go into that next escrow. And then that escrow has to fund and record. There's a couple days right there. There's 3 or 4 days right there. Then that one may be owner occupied. That's also contingent on them finding a house. So they may need 3 or 4 days to move out at the minimum. So I know at a minimum, I'm going to need 7 days after close. I put the 10 just to give me a cushion so that the buyer already knows that they're not putting pressure on the seller to get out when they have nowhere to go. Okay. That's why we put the 10 days. Okay. Questions about occupancy? Anybody? Okay. Let's move on to the tenant occupied. So we're looking at 3M3 now, occupied units by tenants. We're going to, if they haven't checked that box off because there is tenants in the property, these are the 2 ways we're going to go. If we're vacating the tenant, if it's possible, because I will tell you, if this is units in the state of California, you cannot vacate the tenant to sell the property. Anywhere in California. I'm not even talking about just rent control in the city of LA. I'm talking about anywhere in California. If it is units, you can't vacate the tenants unless you have cause. If it is a single family, I can vacate the tenants in order to help facilitate the sale for the buyers to move in. So if we are agreeing to vacating the tenants, seller will begin eviction process once buyer has removed all contingency. Buyers agree to extend escrow as necessary to allow seller to complete eviction. And then in red, I put in there just a caveat, if possible to evict based on local and state ordinances, as well as existing moratorium. That was, originally that was written when we had the COVID stuff, but regardless, you've got to check to make sure it's possible that you can vacate the tenant before you agree to vacate tenants. My feeling is if it's not a single family, you're selling it with the tenants in possession. And if I'm selling it with the tenants to remain in possession, the counter is this: tenants to remain in possession. Any eviction to be a responsibility of the buyer. CAR form TOPA to be incorporated, form provided to be signed in return with this signed counteroffer. Even if you're vacating the tenants, you've agreed to that, you still have to put the TOPA. If you're selling it with the property and the tenants in possession, you still have to put the TOPA. So regardless of which of these 2 counters you're putting in place for a tenant occupied property, this section right here has to be incorporated if it wasn't already included. If it were included but not filled out properly, you've got to now fill it out and send it back. But it's still going to be included. Okay? Questions about the tenants? About those counters? Anybody? Yes,
I do,
Jenny.
Kyle.
Yes, Jenny.
So if a seller is wanting to give the tenant a 60-day notice before listing or while listing, they just cannot?
Not in units. Not in units. If it's a single family, yes. In units, you cannot evict a tenant unless you have cause. Now, if you sell it with the tenants in possession, units, and the buyer who's buying it needs to move into one, they have the right to evict the tenant because they're moving in. And depending on where you're selling it, the relocation fees could be, a lot or very little. But the buyer who wants to move into one of those units would have the right to evict, not the seller.
Let me understand a little bit, because we're about to take on a listing with 3 units and they're all occupied. Mm-hmm. So if the seller wants to open it up for an FHA, for a pool of FHA buyers and not just investors, because the rents are so low, it's not going to make sense for an investor. Mm-hmm. What is the best way to do it to open the pool for a first-time home buyer?
You can't. They'd have to be able to look. A first-time home buyer has 60 days to move in to their unit. So if they can negotiate something with the buyer that the tenant will be out in less than 60 days, then they can do that. But you can't evict a tenant. Now, if the tenant says, yeah, pay me and I'll move out, and you pay them and they move out, nothing wrong with that. You
like
negotiate
cash for keys situation?
You negotiate a cash for keys with them. That's different.
Gotcha. Okay.
Okay. And again, I appreciate that these things are going to come up, and we'll talk about this stuff. Probably next week we're going to start the RPA, but I want to try to keep on task with the counters at the moment. Alba, you had a question.
Hi, Kyle. Yes, so
Hi.
you said that there's no that they can't vacate the tenants unless there is a cause. Can you give an example of what a cause would be?
Oh, yeah. A cause would be violating their lease agreement or rental agreement. Any violation of that, whatever their lease and rental agreement states, if they violate that, add an extra person, somebody's staying in the house that's not on the agreement, or running a business, or they haven't paid their rent, or they're damaging the property, something like that, where they've caused an issue that they've now either breached their rental or lease agreement. That's cause. That's cause.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Matthew says, would this differ from city and county of Los Angeles? Well, the city of LA, the rent control part of city of LA, that's part of LAHUD, that's a whole different thing. It's still, you can't evict anybody without paying them relocation, and they don't have to accept the relocation, and the relocation is exorbitant. I think it's a little as like $9,800. It could be as much as $20,000. So it's a lot of money. I don't know the exact numbers. I have them somewhere, and I could look them. I could bring them up, but we'll do that when we do the RPA. But yeah, it's different in the city of LA than it would be anywhere else in the state of California. Yes. Okay. The next one, paragraph 3 and 4, we're not going to look at the seller delivery of documents. My thing is, I'm not going to counter that time period. I'm just going to deliver them as soon as possible, especially if I'm asking them to shorten their time periods. But we're talking about the smoke detector, the water heater. It says by default, I have to install that within 7 days of acceptance. I have to put that in 7 days. So if I'm not going to do that, I got a counter. So it says here, right? Seller must by default install smoke detectors, carbon monoxide and water heater bracing for 7 days. If you know your seller will not do that, you must counter it. As example, seller will install smoke detectors, water heater bracing, and carbon monoxide detectors within blank days after acceptance, or seller will install smoke detector, water heater bracing after buyer has removed all contingencies. But you have to note, this may cause an appraisal to require a reinspection. The contract calls for the seller to be responsible if the cause of the reinspection was due to the seller, so you must include a counter for that. Buyer understands that delay of these installations may cause an appraisal reinspection. Buyer agrees to be responsible for any and all reinspection fees charged. Okay, so most people do not install all this stuff in the first 7 days. The problem is it's a contractual thing. And if I don't address it and the appraiser goes out and says, oh no, I need smoke detectors, I need carbon monoxide detector, I need the water heater strap, and then I have to go back for a reinspection, the contract states that the seller's responsible for that reinspection fee. So I want to address it. Right? I want to address that. So I'm going to say, if that's the case, I'm not going to do it in that first 7 days so that it's done when the appraiser comes out. I'm telling you right now, I'm doing it at this point. And when I do it, if the appraiser has to come out, you're responsible for it. That's fine. You could do that. That's not an issue. Or you could just tell your seller, I need you to do it in the first 7 days. Okay. Next up, paragraph 3P1 and 2. These are the items included and excluded. This is pretty straightforward. But one of the things that we miss as listing agents, and I think we miss it often, is in the included items. Okay. When we put in the MLS that things are included, or we put in any of our advertisements that things are included, washers, dryers, dishwashers, refrigerators, whatever it is, items that could be considered personal items that are included in the sale of the house, and we get an offer that doesn't have those items checked off, okay, we've got to counter back to say that those items are going to be included in the sale, because if we don't, when we close escrow and we've left them with personal items and debris and trash and stuff that we're responsible for cleaning out. So if you are going to leave something and the buyer's agent doesn't include it in there, you need to include it. You need to still put in the counter that, like right here, it says if buyer does not incorporate items into the RPA you have stated, you have to counter items, whatever they are included in the sale of the property. That's it. If they request something that you don't want to leave behind, so let's say they make a request here in P1, they request something that wasn't going to be incorporated. You have to counter it. Item are not, is or are not included in the sale of property. Pretty straightforward, but you have to do that. Make sure you check here the things that may or may not be checked off. Now, if you're going to remove something that should be a fixture and should be included, buyer to be aware, items is or are excluded from the sale of the property. Or you can, without having a counter, if it's something that's supposed to be included, a light fixture, ceiling fan, something that's supposed to be plants, you can either have your seller remove them prior to marketing the property, or you have to make sure that you counter them, that they're not going to be included. Now, here's the thing. In the market we've been in for the last, 10 years at least, you can do that counter of saying, I'm excluding something that should be included without any kind of compensation. If our market ever changes, or I should say not if, when our market changes to a buyer's market as opposed to a seller's market, if you're going to exclude some items from the sale, if it's something that the seller is adamant that they want, you're probably going to have to compensate or replace prior to marketing. So you either say, hey, I'm not going to replace it, but I'll market it and I'll pay you a credit of X because I'm taking it. I'm basically buying it from you. Or I can just replace it altogether prior to me showing it to any buyers. That's not happening right now. Now is just, hey, I'm keeping it and that's it. I mean, we might get to a point where that's going to be an issue for buyers, but it isn't at this point. Okay. So if they ask for something that you didn't want to include, you got to counter it. If you're including something and they didn't put it in the purchase agreement, you got to counter it to make sure it's included. And if you're asking for something that should be included in the sale, a fixture, right? Something attached to the property, and you're asking to take that with you, you've got to counter it. It's got to be put in there if they didn't already put it in the purchase agreement. Okay. 3Q1, the NHD report, you really only have to do this if it's blank or if they asked for a company that you don't want to use. But you're going to counterback seller to provide NHD report prepared by name of company you use or seller's choice. Doesn't matter. Either one of those is fine. Now, the reason that you want to make sure that the seller is paying for that is because technically it is replacing a seller's disclosure. So if the seller doesn't pay for it, if you force the buyer to pay for it, then is the seller really providing the disclosure? That's just always my concern. I don't like that question. I don't like the gray area. So always have the seller pay for the natural hazard disclosure report. Okay. Next would be in Q2 and 3. So Q3 is where somebody would write if they're asking for a termite report, right? I am always going to counter it out. I'm always going to counter out. Seller, either I'm going to do one of two things. Either I am going to provide you with the termite inspection report and who's going to provide it and all that stuff and pay a maximum of X, right? This is all I'm going to pay. So that way, for example, if I give you a termite report for my termite company says it's going to be $2,200 to do it. And then you get your own termite company to come in and they say with the same amount of work, that's the one thing that you have to pay attention to, same amount of work, but they're going to charge $2,500. Well, I am wanting to limit my damages to what I know my company is going to do. So what I would do is say, seller to provide termite inspection report prepared by whatever the termite company name is. And I'm going to pay a maximum of $2,200 for Section 1 repairs and buyer to be responsible for the balance of cost of any Section 1 repairs and any required Section 2 repairs. So now what happens is this. You got your company that says it's $2,800. I got mine that says it's $2,200. Those reports are identical. It's the same amount of work. It's just this company is charging more. And the buyer is adamant that I'm going to use my termite company. Cool, go for it. But I'm paying a maximum of $2,200. So if your company's not going to lower their cost to $2,200, whatever it is that you have to pay is that. That's it. And it's only for Section 1. My max is $2,200 for Section 1. So if there's any Section 2 responsibility, which is the preventative maintenance and termite repairs, if you guys see that, then that's the max I'm going to pay, and the buyer's going to be responsible for all of Section 2. That's what I'm going to do if I'm going to pay for it. If I'm not going to pay for it, right? I don't want this to become a lender requirement. I'm going to put seller will not provide a termite inspection report or complete any repairs or clearance. That's it. If I am going to give them a termite report because I have one or whatever the case is, they asked for a report, but they didn't ask for repairs, then I'm going to put in there, seller will provide a termite inspection report, buyer to be responsible for any required repairs and clearance. I'm putting it back on the buyer. It's not my responsibility. My suggestion for all of you guys is get it out, period. Don't ever have it in a purchase agreement. Just take it out. Now, the new thing that's added is paragraph Q2, 3Q2, which is the fortress wildlife disclosure. It got added in a couple months ago, and at first it was you could only pick fortress wildlife, but now the drop down has a not applicable in there. The fortress wildlife disclosure is not required. It's not a required for it's optional, and it goes hand in hand with your NHD report if the property is in a high or very high fire zone, right, where we have to then include that fire hardening disclosure. But this report, this fortress wildfire disclosure report, is more specific as to where the wildfire danger is. Now, the benefit of that wildfire disclosure, this fortress wildlife disclosure, is it could help with the buyer's homeowner's insurance. But again, it is not required. So if your seller does not want to pay to provide that, you could put in there the seller, this is not applicable, or seller will not provide fortress wildfire disclosure if required by lender, or I should put insurer in there, buyer to be responsible for obtaining the report, right? Like we're going to put it back on the buyer if your seller doesn't want to pay for it. Now, if I'm in a high fire zone, if I'm in one of those areas where I know that that's going to be an issue, it's going to be hard for me to get homeowners insurance for the buyers because of the fire danger, or I have to make extra disclosures, I'm probably going to order that form and see if it helps the marketability of my property, because maybe it makes my property more insurable in that neighborhood, brings me up. So again, it becomes a business decision. Okay. Paragraph 3Q 5 and 6, government required point of sale inspections reports and the corrective and remedial actions. Okay. Required city inspection reports. If seller is not willing to make required repairs, seller will provide city of blank pre-sale inspection report. Seller will not complete any required repairs. Buyers to take responsibility with the city of blank to complete required repairs after the close of escrow. The same thing could be said for the city of LA with the 9A report. Like, hey, I'm going to give you the 9A report, but if there's anything that shows up in there, that's the responsibility of the buyer, right? It's the same thing. We have to provide those reports. There is no ifs, ands, or buts about it. There's nothing that says, now, I think it's like, can't remember what city it is, Hawthorne or El Segundo. It's somebody over there that will let you pay and waive it. You just have to do it in a certain amount of time for the report. But the cities that we deal in, Compton, Linwood, Inglewood, Huntington Park, all these areas, the Southgate, you can't waive the report. The report has to get provided. The buyer can take responsibility for the clearance of those things that show up on those reports, but they have to get done. Have to. So you guys got to stop with this waiver stuff. Now, if you're a buyer's agent and the seller's like, well, you want your offer accepted, it's going to get waived, that's a whole different thing we have to deal with. There's some steps that we can take to kind of, help protect you a little bit, but it is not legal to waive those. Okay, just so you know. So those are what the counters are. Make sure you're countering that my seller is going to provide that report. Just you are going to be responsible for the repairs. Now, if the seller is willing to do all those repairs and get everything cleared off, then you don't need to counter anything. You just get the report and send it to the buyer. The home warranty, this is if necessary. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped over escrow. You only need to do this if it contains anything other than each their own or seller's choice in the escrow section, right? So if you get to Q7 and it says seller to pay or both to pay, and the escrow holder is some other escrow that you don't know, then you counter back that it's going to be each their own fees, and either who the escrow is or escrow to be seller's choice. Same thing with title. Seller shall pay for Otis title insurance policy issued by the title company and rep name or seller's choice. Make sure that you guys, if you're going to state a title company, you don't have to do it with escrow so much, but with title, with home warranty, if I'm going to counter a specific company, I've got to make sure that I counter my rep's name, because if for some reason it ends up at a different escrow or whatever, I want to make sure that the escrow doesn't just choose, because if you get to an escrow and you just put, Stewart Title or North American or Fidelity Title or whatever, our escrow is more than likely going to use the reps that you guys know. That's the same reps. But if for some reason you just put a company name, they don't always give it to that rep, and especially if it's an outside office, okay, an outside escrow. Okay, so the home warranty, same thing. Seller shall pay cost not to exceed blank for a 1-year home warranty plan to be issued by your company for basic coverage. Or if you're including optional coverage, you have to list what that coverage is and make sure the money is sufficient to cover it. So for example, if I get an offer that says seller's going to pay for a home warranty, and they have like $600 or $800 in here, but they have no special coverages on there, then basically what they're asking for is they're asking for a basic coverage. I know they're not. They're trying to get some of the elevated coverages, but they're not asking for it. It needs to be included, because this says home warranty plan chosen by buyer coverage includes, but is not limited to. Well, there's no extra coverage, so that means it's basic. So if I get an offer like that, I'm going to counter back to what the basic cost is. Okay. If they want the extra coverage, they need to ask for it. Or if I'm going to give them extra coverage, I'm going to state what coverage is in there. But if they're not giving me the right amount, I'm going back to basic, plain and simple. That's how it works. Okay. Questions about anything so far? Because we're going to jump ahead quite a bit here, as we've gotten through paragraph 3, which is where we actually fill stuff out. So any questions before I jump ahead? Okay. All right. So we're going to jump all the way down here to paragraph. Oops, I went too far now. We're going to go to paragraph 29, which is liquidated damages. I only need to counter that if for some reason the buyer didn't initial it, or if the buyer did initial it and my seller doesn't want that to be part of the contract. Okay. But if they didn't, and I suggest everybody wants it to be, if they didn't initial it, it just says buyer to initial paragraph 29 of the RPA and return an updated page 14 with the RPA. And the same thing goes with the dispute resolution. These two paragraphs, if they're going to be incorporated, have to be initialed by both parties. Okay. That's how it has to work. Jesus, go ahead. You had your hand up.
Yes, I'm sorry. I was driving. I couldn't unmute on time. Going back to the NHD really quick, Brandon mentioned the environmental is very important, because that's what the pipes and all the gas that go below the property. So it's always wise to ask for the environmental, since it's only $10 more.
Okay. Okay. That's fine. You could add that into your counters if you want to incorporate that. Sure. That's good advice. Yes, Jesus. Oh, it said you had your hand up again, but it looks like you don't. Okay.
Thank you. No.
No. Okay. All right. So that's it for those two things: liquidated damages and arbitration of disputes. They have to be initialed by both parties to be incorporated. So if for some reason they haven't initialed it and you want to incorporate it, you've got to counter back buyer to initial these two paragraphs and return that copy of that page, an updated copy of that page with their counteroffer. And now the last thing, when we get down here, we're talking about backup offers, right? If we're going to include that, if we're going to accept somebody as a backup offer, the counter would look like this: buyer aware that this offer is being accepted as a backup offer subject to cancellation of current contract. Buyers are aware they are backup offer position number, whatever they are, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Backup offer addendum to be incorporated in this agreement, form provided to be signed and returned with this counteroffer. No, the reason I want that is if I'm doing a backup offer because I've accepted an offer already and I want them to be ready to go, I'm countering them all the terms. The mistake we make as a listing agent is we tell, hey, you're a backup offer, and then we don't give them anything, no counter offers, nothing. We just say, oh, we're going to keep your offer as a backup, and we don't counter them. We don't do anything. And then when our transaction cancels, the escrow that we're currently in, and we go back to one of those people that we were a backup offer, and we say, oh, hey, you guys still want it? And they say yes. Then we have to either now counter them or have them draft another offer. And then what happens if I do all the counters and they go, we don't like this? If I want backup offers and I counter them all at the same time, like let's say that I accept an offer, like I get 6 offers and I accept one of them and 2 of the other 6 I want to be backups. So I accept one, I send multiple counter offers to the other 2 that I want as backups. I put that verbiage in with all the other terms that I need to counter in their offer, the price, everything that I need them to accept. They accept it. If the escrow that I accept, the contract that I accepted, and we go into escrow, that one cancels, all I have to do is call up backup number 1 and say, you ready to go? And they say yes, and we open escrow tomorrow because they've already agreed to terms. So stop taking shortcuts with the backup offers. If you really want somebody to be a backup, this is the way that you do it. Okay? All right, so that was all the counters. Again, if I did send you the counter offers, I did add a couple things in there. So if I did send you the counter offers last week, just send me an email. I'll send you this one that I updated. I apologize for that. I missed something last week when we did it. So we looked at how to write the counters. Let's look at the forms quickly, if I can get to them. So we're going to look at the seller multiple and the seller counteroffer. Again, if you write a seller's counteroffer, remember that if they sign and return that, once they sign and return it, that's an accepted offer. That's an accepted offer. Once you get it back, it's accepted. Now, if I do it on a multiple counter, it's not accepted again until my seller signs this, unless they send me a buyer counteroffer that I'm not required to sign this anymore. And the buyer counteroffer is right here. So if I get a buyer's counteroffer, I send a seller multiple counter to a buyer, and the buyer responds with the buyer counteroffer, and I sign and accept this, we now have an accepted offer. I don't need to re-sign paragraph 8. Okay, the buyer signs 7 and sends me this buyer, and I sign accepting this as seller in paragraph 4, we're accepted. Okay, I don't need to re-sign this. But if I send a multiple counter, if I send this multiple counter offer out and the buyer does not counter, they just sign and accept, I now have an accepted offer here. Okay, that's what these forms. So make sure, my suggestion is I would use the multiple counter form just to give me some flexibility, even if I'm only countering one offer. Okay, that's what I would do. Now, if I mistakenly send a seller counter offer and then I get a better offer after I've sent this out, but the buyer hasn't signed and returned this to me yet, then I would use this form, which is called a withdrawal of offer. Offer, counter, offer not yet accepted. Buyer has made an offer dated blank on a purchase agreement. This is the property. Seller has issued a counter offer dated whatever the date is. I am the buyer or seller making the offer counter, but hereby withdraws and revokes it. Now it's gone. Like I just took it from you completely. Or, right, if checked, confirmation, this document confirms the counteroffer was orally withdrawn or revoked, right? I can call you over the phone and say, hey, it's withdrawn. I'm just sending you this to let you know. You should do that anyway. So I would check that box off. And if you're going to replace it with a multiple counter, I just check this box right here and I give them a multiple counter with it. So now I can get everybody involved into the transaction instead of just that original one. Okay, that's the right way to do it. So again, if you don't want to have to worry about that, you can give yourself some flexibility by using the multiple counter offer. But if you do use a counter offer and for some reason need to change it to a multiple, as long as you call them and send them this prior to them returning it, you can replace it with a multiple counter offer. Okay. Any questions, guys? No questions. You guys got it. Terrific. What I'm going to do is I'm probably going to start the RPA again next Thursday. So we'll get into that and we can get, into the nuts and bolts of all these things. Again, reminder, if you came on late or if you missed any part of this for some reason, it'll be on YouTube later. If you're watching this on YouTube later and you did request for me to send you those counter offers last week, please send me another email today to get the updated ones. Those of you that have been on these live, if I gave you that counter offer yesterday or any day prior to today, send me an email so I can give you the updated one, and I apologize for that mistake. Go ahead, Tina.
So just to be clear, if I send an SEO and I do get an offer, another offer before the buyer accepts the seller counter offer, I can trump that with a woo, couldn't I still? I mean, that's what I did this last time.
Yes,
okay.
Yes. As long you just check that box, call them saying I'm sending you right now with a withdrawal of offer and I'm replacing it with a multiple counter, or just I'm withdrawing my counter offer to you at all.
Got it. Okay. Just wanted to make that clear. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. Any other questions, guys? No? All right. So I look forward to, again, starting the RPA next week. So I'm sure there's been a lot of you that are on here that haven't gone through it with me, and it always needs updating because there's always new stuff that comes out. So we'll be talking about that starting next week. Otherwise, if you guys missed any of this, look for it on YouTube later today. And I thank you all for being here. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Have a great day.